I'm joined now by Bill Browder, who once ran the largest foreign investment firm in Russia, but subsequently became known as Putin's public enemy number one after he was expelled from the country when his own lawyer was murdered in 2009. And Bill is also the author of Freezing Order. Bill, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Nice to have you on the programme again. Can we start with the sanctions? Because I know you've said before that the Russian economy is suffering. $350 billion of central bank reserves there have been frozen. Wealthy oligarchs have had their assets frozen as well. But we hear from Russia, they claim that their economy shrank only by 2% last year. Vladimir Putin saying sanctions have not succeeded and will not succeed.
Well, first of all, I think that anything they say you have to discount heavily, because everything that comes out of Vladimir Putin's mouth is a lie. And obviously the sanctions are having a dramatic effect. If you have 1,000 Western companies pulling out, if you have all Russian banks frozen from doing business with the West, if you have all this money, central bank money frozen, all the oligarch money frozen, of course sanctions are going to be having an impact. And so, it may not be the impact that we're hoping for. We may not have bankrupted Russia, but of course sanctions are having an impact. Having said that, there is one huge elephant in the room, one huge loophole, which is that while all this stuff is being frozen, Russia continues to sell between $500 million and $1 billion a day of oil and gas to the West and to the East. And that money is used to then pay for missiles and soldiers to kill Ukrainians. And so as long as the West continues to buy Russian oil and gas, basically Putin will be able to continue to afford the war. Mm-hmm. And that's the big loophole. That's the big problem.
So if those sanctions are not working, the West only has itself to blame.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a question. Do we want to have higher oil prices, or do we want to have Putin continue to kill Ukrainians? I would say that we should probably suck up our gut a little bit, let the oil prices stay high, and just completely cut off Russia. And if we did that, if we cut off Russia, and then he didn't have the money, then he physically wouldn't be able to continue to do this war. And this war, the longer it carries on, the more damage it does, not just to Ukraine, but to the whole world. There's so many different places that are affected by this. There's the food prices for all sorts of wheat and other stuff. There are refugees flowing into many Western countries. There's all sorts of stuff, byproducts of this war, which would stop if we just stop buying, if everybody stopped buying Russian oil and gas.
Yeah, difficult to do given the energy crisis that we are now in, and the pace of developing non-fossil fuel energy sources is not matching demand. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's their big strength in this whole thing is that. And the other thing is that even if we, and I say we meaning the United States, Europe, UK, Australia, et cetera, even if we all come together and want to do something, you still have a lot of countries which are basically not on our side on this thing. You have China and India and South Africa and Turkey and the United Arab Emirates that are either on Russia's side or sitting it out. And as long as they do that, then it's kind of hard to hold the whole the Russians' feet to the fire in this thing.
You have an interview here in The Currency this morning, and you say there, the Irish government is wobbly on military aid and financial aid to Ukraine. Now, I'm sure the Irish government would challenge that. What do you mean by wobbly?
Well, I wasn't meaning to single out the Irish government. I'm singling out all Western governments, which is that everybody has sort of said, at the beginning, you remember a year ago, they said no weapons for Ukraine. And then after the invasion, they said, okay, we'll give them bullets and helmets. And then after that, we said, well, actually, maybe we'll give them artillery. And then after that, we said, well, maybe we'll give them long-range artillery. And so on and on and on, tanks a couple of weeks ago. And if we had just done all this stuff at the very beginning, there'd be so much smaller loss of life. There would be so much of a better situation for the Ukrainians. And the Russians may have really been pushed back much further. The fact is that everything is always drip feeding out there. And this is not even, it's not like by accident. This is a conscious decision that's being taken by Western governments, pretty much led by the United States. And everybody is basically saying, we don't want to escalate this conflict.
Yes.
And they're saying, we don't want to escalate this conflict. Well, Putin is escalating this conflict. Mm-hmm. And every time he hears us saying, we don't want to escalate this conflict, he smiles, because that's just appeasement talk. It doesn't matter what we do. It matters that he wants to win this war, and he's going to continue to throw men and artillery at this thing. And the only way to stop him is by giving the Ukrainians what they're begging for, what they're asking for, so that they can fight him off. It's not us escalating, it's him escalating.
Do you not accept, though, that it is a very difficult balance to strike, supporting Ukraine in their efforts to fend off Putin and not starting World War III?
Well, the thing is, we're not going to start World War III. We give the Ukrainians everything they need. It's not as if Russia is going to all of a sudden say, okay, we're at war with NATO. I mean, they can barely handle the Ukraine, which was considered to be not even a very serious army before, and Ukraine is pushing them back. I mean, there's not a chance in the world that Russia would challenge NATO right now. If they did, they would be gone in 3 days.
Mm-hmm. I just see that there were plans in Russia to test this intercontinental missile called Satan II. And sometimes you would wonder, because Putin is so unpredictable, whether he is just waiting for a NATO country to do something so that he can then move this on. Is that what he wants to do?
Absolutely not. He understands that he would be decimated. First of all, nobody is going to send off a nuclear weapon to a NATO country, because then NATO countries will send a nuclear weapon back at him. That's called mutually assured destruction. That's what's kept the world safe for the last 70 years. Now, if he wants to do something conventional, he understands that he just doesn't have the capacity to fight NATO. It's just an impossibility. And so, you have to understand that this guy is a thug. He's a bully. He makes lots of threats. But most of these threats he can't back up with real action. And so for him to be, saying, I'm pounding his chest, I'm going to test out this ballistic missile, you better not provide weapons to Ukraine, that is just, kind of bluster and bullying. And at the end of the day, it's Ukraine is not attacking Russia. Ukraine is defending their own territory. Why should we not give them what they need to defend their territory?
So taking all that into account and looking at where we are now, tomorrow is the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you think there's any prospect of a peaceful, negotiated solution at this point or at any stage in the coming months?
No, I think there is no chance of any negotiation that will lead to peace. And I say that because Vladimir Putin can't negotiate. He can't compromise. He can't back down. He never has. It's his any kind of compromise is a sign of weakness in Russia. Any sign of weakness would mean that his power would be challenged, and if he's not in power, he goes to jail and he dies. So he's not going to back down. He's going to double down, triple down, quadruple down. That's what he does. And on the Ukrainian side, it's the same thing. The Ukrainians have been murdered, raped, tortured, children taken from their families, and they're not going to back down. And so there's no chance of a negotiation. The only two options in this war is either Ukraine wins and pushes the Russians out, or Russia wins, in which case they then move on to the next country, which is Estonia, Latvia, Poland, or a NATO country like that, in which case we have 1,000 times worse problem than we do right now.
So then, following on from that, the only solution in your mind is to arm Ukraine to the point where they can push Russia back and end it.
It's the obvious answer to this question. It's the one Russia dreads most, and it's the one that could actually work, because the Ukrainians are defending their freedom, they're defending their lives, they're defending their parents, their children, their wives, and they will push if they're given the tools to do it, they will push the Russians out.
Now, you know more about this than most, sadly. Putin's references in that very lengthy State of the Nation speech the other day to so-called traitors bill. He said Russian authorities could ramp up the pressure on dissenters. Traitors, he said, must be brought to justice. But he said he would not unleash a witch hunt against dissenters. Now, what do you make of that?
He already has done a witch hunt against dissenters. I have many friends who are opposition people opposed to Vladimir Putin who are sitting in jail. Others are dead, and others are in exile. There's no opportunity whatsoever for anybody to in any way challenge Vladimir Putin in Russia.
It's been 1 year since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the cost of that has rippled out into so many different places. So today on Behind the Money, we're going to have a longer episode than we typically do. We'll be spending this time examining the different layers of cost that this last year of war has had. That's the personal cost to individuals, to Ukraine as a country, and to the rest of the world. As you heard, we wanted to start with Pavlo's story as a 28-year-old living in Kyiv when the invasion began. Next, we'll zoom out to talk about what's happened to Ukraine's domestic economy. Then we'll jump to the war's effect on global food prices. And finally, we'll end on how the war has shifted the world's energy markets in irrevocable ways. To understand what's happened to Ukraine's economy, I spoke with the FT's Europe editor, Ben Hall. He says that first, we need more context.
Ukraine is one of the poorest countries in Europe, with a largely Soviet legacy economic structure. And it had been suffering the after effects of multiple crises through the 30 years of independence, starting with the hyperinflation and brutal transition after the collapse of communism and independence in the 1990s. Then the financial crisis, then a very, very severe recession after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and stirred up a war in the east of Ukraine, and then the pandemic.
For many years, Ukraine's economy has been dominated by the production of commodities. That's things like steel, coal, and agricultural crops. Those industries have been largely controlled by oligarchs, and that's led to corruption in business and politics.
These were men who made their fortunes through political connections largely, and then maintained their fortunes and increased their fortunes by using their political influence to make sure others did not challenge them. And it's one of the reasons that has held the Ukrainian economy back. It's made the economy uncompetitive because these are wealthy men who are trying to extract rents from their assets and don't want competition. And that has meant that the Ukrainian economy has lacked dynamism.
Still, at the end of 2021, just as Ukraine was emerging from the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic, things were starting to look brighter.
Ukraine was beginning to recover and was enjoying some kind of international investor interest as an emerging economy.
Then the invasion began.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
Russian tanks rolling across the border from Belarus in the north and Crimea in the south.
Millions of Ukrainians, mostly women and children, fled the country. 5 to 6 million more were internally displaced. Ben estimates that a third of all Ukrainian companies completely stopped production.
Then there was the direct impact of the fighting itself. Take Mariupol, for example, the city in the southeast of the country. The Ukrainians fought a last-ditch resistance in one of the steel plants there. Those two steel plants were essentially destroyed, and those two steel plants alone accounted for 40% of Ukraine's steel output. The Russians have also bombed all sorts of other bits of heavy industry, oil refineries, other industrial plants. Russia's effective blockade of the Black Sea has meant that it's been very, very difficult for the remaining factories working in Ukraine to actually export their goods of steel and farmers to export their grain. So even those bits of Ukrainian industry and agriculture that are working normally have really struggled to get their goods to market.
One bright spot in Ukraine's economy over the past year has been its technology sector.
It's been much easier for Ukrainian tech companies to keep going because workers with a laptop can essentially work from anywhere. So this sector has actually done pretty well and even appears to have increased its sales in 2022, and obviously now accounts for a much larger share of Ukrainian exports, which have overall shrunk because of the war. And I suspect what's happened is a lot of foreign companies have wanted to support Ukraine by employing the tech sector.
With the tech sector rising, power started shifting away from the oligarchs who held so much of it, especially away from the ones accused of supporting or colluding with Russia.
They will have had their TV stations shut down, or they will have been expelled from the country. but also those oligarchs who are not pro-Russian, who are Ukrainian patriots, have also suffered in this war, not least because many of their industrial assets have been badly damaged in the fighting, or their business activities have suffered because of the problems in getting exports out of the country, or because of other disruption caused by the war. You've seen the government, for example, seize and nationalize assets owned by oligarchs to serve the war effort. And I think you've seen a real shift in Ukrainian public opinion because of the war, which is a desire to want to see Ukraine change for the better over the longer term.
Ben says that the war has proven how resilient and adaptable the country can be. Still, as long as Russian missiles are battering Ukrainians and their infrastructure, this year is likely to be another grim one.
There's a huge backlog now of infrastructure that needs to be repaired and rebuilt, and that will probably take many months before that work even starts to happen.
Before the invasion, Andrei Vadatuski's family grain business, Nibulon, was booming.
We had one of the best years in the history before the war started, because basically we had the biggest crop ever, because Ukraine produced more than 100 million tons of grains. There was a shortage of grains in the world, so that is why the demand was high, the prices were high.
Andrei's father founded the company in the 1990s. It employs around 6,000 people and operates out of a southern Ukrainian city that's known as a grain hub for the country.
Everything was working well until 24th of February. And actually, everything stopped just in one morning.
Ukraine is a major exporter of grain and sunflower oil. But that ground to a halt at the start of the invasion. Russia blocked millions of tons of crops from leaving Ukrainian ports.
Some of our fleet was stolen, the grain was stolen, some our employees were killed. That's a new reality. We actually stopped receiving the credit lines from abroad. International finances just disappeared because of the war risk in Ukraine.
Things got even harder for Andrei. Over the summer, his mother and father were killed in an early morning missile strike. And the very next day, Andrei says he had to take over the company under these tragic circumstances.
I had to find the way and to try to predict the future, try to plan the financing, plan to discuss with the banks the future and the different possibilities which exist in the company when nobody knows how to predict the future. Your decision is influencing not only the life of 6,000 people, but others, the farmers, the relatives of employees. It's a huge economic effect. Actually, the banks as well. Because their financial results depend on our performance as well, because we are big creditors for many banks, and it's important for them that Nibulon is serving the debts.
But Andrei is still pushing forward.
We will never become the same company as it was before the war. The same as Ukraine. Ukraine will never be the same as before the war. It will be different. How different, we don't know. So the most important is to survive, to save the business during this period of time, and then hope for rebuilding it back.
The hits that Ukraine's grain industry has taken over the last year have been felt in different ways around the world. That's because of the important role that Ukraine plays in the supply chain. Here's the FT's commodities correspondent, Emiko Terrazono.
It's a number 5 wheat exporter, and a lot of countries in the Middle East and Africa rely on Ukrainian grain. It's a number 3 exporter of corn, which is a main source of feed for livestock. And it's a big producer of sunflower oil. It's the number 1 exporter with a share of just under 40% of the world's international market.
But Ukraine wasn't the only country playing an important role in the supply chain.
Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat. And the fear was that the war would also mean that Russian wheat and also fertilizer would stop flowing out of the country.
And a lot of it did. In response to the invasion, Western nations and companies restricted how they traded with Russia. Many countries that relied on the more affordable Ukrainian and Russian grain had to find expensive alternatives.
Proximity is very important in grain trading. If you're Somalia and Yemen, relying on aid, so what happens is the aid agencies buy from Russia and Ukraine and then send that off to places that are extremely poor. But the war made that impossible.
A food crisis here in Tunisia and much of North Africa.
In northwest Syria, prices for food are skyrocketing.
11,000 tons of wheat arrived in Lebanon this week, but this will be the last shipment from Ukraine.
So countries which rely on the Black Sea have been hit very, very hard. Turkey, for instance, relies on both Russia and Ukraine for wheat, and its food inflation has soared. If you're in one of the war-torn African countries and you need food aid, that's also been affected by the war as well. So the scars are quite deep, I would say.
Last summer, the most vulnerable countries were bracing for famine. The prices for food and other commodities had peaked around May. And food became this focal point of accusations between the West and Russia. The West accused Russia of weaponizing food. Russia blamed the widespread food crisis on Western sanctions, even though food and fertilizers were exempt from the restrictions. Then, in July, the United Nations and Turkey brokered a deal between Russia and Ukraine to get grain moving out of the Black Sea ports again.
That really calmed nerves and brought prices down. It was regarded as a huge breakthrough because a lot of people were saying, well, what's in it for Moscow? I guess Putin needed the developing countries on side to convince them it wasn't the invasion that was causing food insecurity around the world. It was sanctions from the West as a result of the invasion. So it was a bit of a twisted logic on his side, I think. But the fact that the grain started flowing was a huge relief to everyone concerned.
1 year on, food prices aren't near the peaks they hit last year.
I think prices have stabilized. They've come down from their post-invasion peaks, although that's still historically quite high. I think the stability is quite precarious, though, and when I talk to officials in places like the World Bank, one of them described to me that the current situation is flying with one engine, and the risk of something going wrong, like the grain deal not being renewed, or energy prices going up again, or bad weather in one of the key producing countries, that could send grain and fertilizer prices soaring again.
So Ukraine's economy has suffered huge blows this year. The world's food security teeters on the brink. You could at least make the argument that inflation and food scarcity are a predictable outcome of war. But perhaps less predictable has been the effects of this invasion on the world's energy markets.
The full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia last year has had a seismic impact on the oil market. I mean, really far beyond what anybody might have previously anticipated, and ultimately unprecedented in the history of the oil market.
That's the FT's energy correspondent Tom Wilson talking there. He says that by the time the invasion happened, global energy markets were already under strain.
Basically, ever since world leaders signed the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, pressure had been building on Western oil and gas companies to slow and, in some cases, cease investment in new fossil fuels. And then that pressure accelerated during the COVID pandemic when restrictions on movement crushed oil demand overnight, led to further shutdowns of big oil company operations, and that led to lots of predictions that maybe oil demand had peaked. Maybe we're at the end of the oil era. But then when we were coming out of the worst of the COVID pandemic at the end of 2021 and restrictions were being lifted in lots of parts of the world, then we saw this massive resurgence of demand for oil and gas as industry went back to work, as people started to drive and travel again. I think a lot of people forget how strained global energy markets were already at the end of 2021.
Soon after news of Russia's attacks broke, Tom opened an email on his phone.
3 days after the invasion started, I was actually in the park in London with my kids and received a press statement from BP, the British headquartered oil company, that it was going to exit their joint venture with Rosneft.
He knew instantly that this was an unprecedented announcement. Rosneft is one of Russia's state-owned oil producers, and BP owned about 20% of that business.
I think at the time the statement dropped from their press officer, I was actually on the phone with a source who previously worked at BP, very knowledgeable about the business. That person had said to me, BP won't leave. The joint venture's too important. They'll hold on. They can weather the storm.
But that didn't happen. Now, it's important to say that before Russia started this invasion, it was the largest exporter of energy in the world.
Not the second largest or the third largest, but the biggest. It was responsible for about 10% of the world's oil and a third of Europe's gas. Historically, the energy industry has taken that position. It's felt that the world needs energy. Oil and gas are a vital source that underpins the global economy. So therefore, there's kind of been a view that energy can be apolitical and that oil and gas companies can continue to operate in places where wars are going on. There are countless examples of that through history. So I was surprised at the pace at which the BP management took that decision. With hindsight, it's easy to say, yeah, that was the only option. But at the time, they certainly could have waited and kind of gauged, okay, how does this play out? How does the West respond to the invasion? But this one was different. And it was really that decision that then triggered the swathe of exits that followed, both from other Western oil and gas companies like Shell and Exxon, and also from other Western banks and insurance providers and professional service companies that all made efforts to wind down their business in Russia as a consequence.
Tom says BP's exit from Russia signaled the beginning of the biggest change in the global oil market in many decades.
The impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the oil market has been profound. We've had other energy crises, such as in the 1970s, which led to the formation of the OPEC cartel. And this is really on a par with that, if not more significant, because of the lasting impact it's going to have on the way in which oil moves around the world.
EU sanctions have banned the import of Russian petroleum products into the region, and that has since pushed Russia's oil exports out to other parts of the world.
So as a consequence of those European sanctions, what we've seen is basically a big game of musical oil barrels. So now we've got this situation in the oil market where Europe used to buy lots of Russian barrels, but that's no longer happening. And instead, Russia is sending its oil mainly to India and China, who are paying a massive discount. China has ramped up imports massively, as has India, which was importing very little Russian crude before, but is now importing 1 million barrels a day, if not more. And then Europe, for its part, is getting its oil now from the Middle East and from the US.
This has significantly changed the balance of power in oil markets and in the world's economy. And Tom says he thinks it's unlikely to go back to the way things were anytime soon.
I think we will see this year, and that will continue into 2024 and even 2025, is the rising power and influence of the Middle Eastern oil producers, and specifically Saudi Arabia. They've benefited over the past 12 months from this period of really high prices. So they are cash rich, and we've seen that demonstrated by the flow of Western bankers and business executives who are going to Riyadh, going to Abu Dhabi to try and raise capital for investments.
Tom says that another example of this was President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia last summer, at the height of the energy crisis when oil prices were over $100 a barrel.
President Biden touched down in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia Friday.
This morning, he is arriving in Saudi Arabia for a controversial meeting with the Saudi crown prince. The goal, to convince the kingdom to ramp up oil production and bring down gas prices.
But Tom says that when push came to shove, Saudi Arabia did the opposite.
It announced a slew of cuts to its production targets and the production targets of the other members of the OPEC, plus producers' cartel that it runs. The White House was livid in response. But really the fact that Saudi was willing to reject that call for help from Washington, the fact they were willing to reject that overture for the first time, also to me signaled a slightly new era where Riyadh and the other major producers in the Middle East would be more forceful going forward when it comes to oil policy.
Higher oil prices have also meant record profits for oil companies all over the world. That includes even those US and European companies that early on faced a financial hit when they agreed to walk away from their Russian projects.
It was seen as a financial sacrifice or commercial sacrifice they were making by committing to divest assets that had historically been quite lucrative. But that commitment has been more than made up for the record profits that they've made due to high oil prices. So Exxon last year made $55 billion, which is the highest annual profit ever recorded by a Western oil company. Chevron made $35 billion. Shell and BP also made their highest ever annual profits. Russia's biggest oil companies did incredibly well. Oil prices were near record levels for most of the year, which meant huge profits for Rosneft.
Tom says that the war over the last year may have been a wake-up call when it comes to how people think about energy security.
I think there had been a tendency to feel in parts of the West that the world was almost moving into a post-industrial period where we no longer needed big industry and we didn't really need energy because we had all of these technological solutions. But ultimately, oil and gas continued to underpin most parts of the modern economy. And I think that had been forgotten. And the energy crisis sparked by the invasion has reminded everybody of that fact. But I think the other positive looking forward is that it has forced governments, particularly in Europe, but also in the US, to wrestle with the realities of the energy transition, possibly for the first time. Previously, there was potentially a sense that maybe there could be a smooth transition from a polluting hydrocarbon-based world to a low or zero carbon future. And I mean, the past 12 months basically showed us how difficult that transition is going to be, how rocky it might be unless it is carefully managed.